Hello, this is at the time in the semester that we would normally be doing night photography. In fact, we'd probably go outside together at night, probably to Columbia Park, and do our night photography. But we can't do that because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't want to give you an assignment that puts you at risk by going out where there'll be crowds or other people. So what I'm going to do is create an abbreviated assignment. Why don't you watch this following video so you can get some ideas about the techniques that you will apply, and you'll learn a little bit more about the exposure and how to handle your camera for night photography. And then I will print an abbreviated assignment in text form in the assignment email. All right. So what is night photography? It is, of course, a record of light, but so what? I mean, all photographs are a record of light. The photographs are usually taken with a long exposure. And again, that's no big deal, right? But it is a big deal because the elements of the photo are brighter than much of the background. And that's much different than a daylight photo, where almost everything has the same amount of light on it. So stuff doesn't glow in a daylight photograph like it does in a night photograph. Sometimes showing movement is a good element, and now we're talking about the creative stuff. So the insignificant points of starlight become more important against a dark sky, and if the exposure is long enough, the dots turn into lines. Now this can only be done with a night photograph. Many night shots are well timed and very dramatic. They're obtained with no trickery. In this shot we see a dark sky just as dusk turns into night, and this is my favorite time to shoot. This dusk to dark period of the evening only lasts about an hour, so you need to plan your locations in advance to get the deep blue sky. Setting your white balance on incandescent will help to make the sky much deeper blue. Some night shots are phony looking montages because no thought was put into the real relationship between the elements in the photo. This isn't to say that all blending of images in Photoshop is bad, but they have to be skillfully done. I did this montage of my wife and granddaughter on a ride at the county fair. They aren't moving at all. I'll show you how that technique was done a little later. Most people that are new to night photography just want to get the basics. That means capturing an interesting sky with a bold object silhouetted in the background, like this shot taken in Thailand. I shifted the scene from blue to red to add drama. Many night photos lend themselves to simple manipulation like this. Let's examine an element that makes night photos more dramatic than day photos. In this shot we have a dark background with interesting placement of light. The result is a simple, stark image that's loaded with great contrast. Now this is the same location in daylight. It's almost the same color as the late afternoon sky. There's nothing compelling about this photograph. But here we see a shot taken from the same angle but later at night. Now we have something that's interesting. We have some interesting elements that are created by the lighting, the very dark sky, and a person lit by a small flashlight. Now this image it's really starting to take shape. With cropping, this image becomes dramatic. We can learn a few important lessons from this shot. One, you've got to pick a location that has bold shapes, like the diagonal stairway. Number two, you got to place your image in a way that creates a balanced composition. Number three, you add lighting where needed to achieve the shadows and the highlights that make a big, powerful statement. Now, number four, very few good night shots are achieved by just walking up to the subject, raising your camera, and snapping a shot. That's what everybody does. Your photos will never look different unless you take the extra steps that this student did in this series of photographs. Night photography records the highlights against a dark background, and that's similar to a velvet painting. It's dramatic. You must envision the dark background as negative space, and then you put your highlights on that. So a way to do that is to shoot from a low angle because it eliminates unwanted clutter and isolates the subject against a dark sky. Try finding interesting shapes and lights that you can isolate by shooting them from a low angle. A lot of elements are already against a clean dark background. If they're lit up, they naturally jump forward in the photograph. This photograph was pretty simple, but it was a little boring, so I waited for a car to pass to get the red streaks. This was a 2-second exposure. This photo would have looked very cluttered in daylight, but at night there's just a few story elements that really pop. The neon sign, the guy on the steps, the motorcycle being lit by car headlamps, they really glow against the dark background. Without a central element, the scenes can look pretty lonely, like this one. You don't have to have a person being the important element. The central subject could be anything, even car headlights, but you must balance the scene with a strong highlight. And in this case, there is nothing that is compelling about this photograph. It's just waiting for something to be put in place. Everything begins with mastering the manual mode. You'll never be able to get good, consistent results in any other mode besides manual if night photography is your goal. When your camera is in any mode except manual, including aperture and shutter priority, it will be reacting to the amount of light in the scene. In aperture priority, that's the AV mode on Canon cameras, you choose the aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed that it thinks is best. In shutter priority, that's TV on Canon cameras, you choose the shutter speed and the camera chooses what it thinks is the best aperture. Program mode is represented by the P on the dial. It's a hybrid of aperture and shutter priority. In all these modes I mentioned, the camera is deciding half of the final exposure, so your camera is still 50% automatic. That's not good enough to get great pictures. If the sky isn't dark yet, we have time for you to experiment with the manual setting. Choose a composition that places some elements in the foreground and the sky in the background. Adjust the exposure to get a nice saturated sky. This shot on the right is where you want your exposure to be at sunset. It's a pretty dark exposure, but the highlight, which is the sun, is pretty bright. Your light meter in your camera will tell you that the photo on the left is properly exposed and the one on the right is way underexposed. But the camera is making the wrong choice. That's why it's important to work in manual mode so you can review the images, make the changes, and get the results you want. If your camera is a point-and-shoot model or a cell phone, you can still darken the image by reducing the overall exposure. Now, all cameras are different, but all of them have a master exposure control. Most night scenes have a lot of dark areas, which we mentioned before. Your camera adjusts the exposure in assisted modes, like aperture and shutter priority, to try to make those dark areas bright enough to be seen in the photo. That results in an error. And it's rarely that any true blacks appear in the shot, and the lights are usually burned up. So any brilliant color from neon signs, street lamps, and store windows is usually washed out. It's often so far overexposed that you can't recover it in Photoshop. So again, do not use any mode except for manual. This is done in manual mode. It's the same shot as the previous screen. And it just proves that you've got to get control of all the aspects of your photograph with manual. Sadly, your camera is very ignorant, and it doesn't know what it's looking at. It's only making a guess at the best exposure by collecting what it thinks is the right amount of light. In normal daylight and even dusk, these modes work fine, but at night, using these modes is a big mistake. In these examples, manual mode was used to darken the image by reducing both the aperture and the shutter. The result is much more accurate on the bottom of the screen. If it's full dark nighttime, let's put our cameras in manual mode and begin with an exposure of 1/5 of a second at f11 using ISO 640. This is just a ballpark guess to get us going. Everything must be in manual mode, including the ISO and the white balance. This is how Nikons look, but Canons aren't much different. See those yellow arrows? They are pointing to the places that indicate we are in full manual mode. Up in the upper left, there's an M that shows for manual mode, and then we have the shutter speed. In the middle, at the top of the frame, that's 1/5 of a second, and then the aperture setting on the upper right is f11. Right about in the middle of the frame is the ISO, and that is 640. Be aware that you cannot have auto ISO. So the auto prefix is not showing here. It is just ISO 640. And then the white balance setting is just under the number 640, and that is set on the sunlight. Now, manual ISO setting is very important because if your camera is set on auto ISO, it'll be raising the ISO to brighten the image, even if that's not what you want it to do. As in the case of the assisted modes we just discussed, your camera will be making areas that should be black into a sick-looking gray. Additionally, the colored lights will burn up in the scene. Manual focus is important to ensure that you'll be focused on the area of your scene that you want to be sharpest. Although autofocus does a very good job in bright light, it often fails in low light. Switch to manual focus. Additionally, turn off the VR. That's vibration resistance on a Nikon camera, and it is IS, image stabilization on a Nikon. Because if you're using a tripod, you don't want those features enabled. In autofocus, your camera may be searching for an element of the scene to focus on. If your camera lens is moving in and out without acquiring a sharp image, it's engaged in searching. Canon cameras with kit lenses are the worst offenders, but other brands also have issues. That's a really good reason to only use manual focus for night photography. You've got to be in manual focus to get a shot like this. Otherwise, your camera would just be searching and looking for something to focus on. It may focus on the bottom of the post and not the light itself. So you've got to be in manual focus. Now that we have a basic knowledge of how to set up our cameras, let's take some shots and meet back here in an hour. I'll have some additional techniques to share with you then. Okay, an hour has gone by. Now let's talk about the snap zoom technique, and because it's really fun. This requires you to rotate your zoom lens during the exposure. In other words, you're zooming in or out while the shutter is open. Let's break down the process of zooming. This technique is achieved by spinning your zoom lens while the shutter is open. It's important to know that the sharpest part of the image is going to be in the center of the frame. Now that doesn't always mean it's the best composition, but you'll be able to crop the image to improve the composition later. Just put what's most important dead center in the frame. This image was taken at a 50th of a second, and the zooming effect is very slight. The longer the exposure, the greater the effect. This one is taken at 1/10 of a second. I feel that 1/10 of a second gives me a consistently good result. Wide-angle lenses increase the effect quite a bit. This was taken at 1/4 of a second. Now it's a bit too much for a band shot, but it's a good effect for just the guitar player. Run tests to help you define what your preferences are. During a long exposure of 1/4 of a second or longer, interesting things happen. Your camera produces wavy lines because it isn't being held still. And some lights that pulse display a jittering effect, like LED lights and some neon lights. These aren't bad things. In fact, they can be used to great effect. Now, this is a snap zoom shot that was done for a commercial assignment for the Alameda County Fair. In this case, I had the camera in manual mode and rotated the zoom lens during the exposure. I also used a flash, which was set at 1/2 power. Now, so this is not a Photoshop trick. This is exactly how the photo came out of the camera. It's just exactly the way it was when I shot it. Let's break this process down so we can learn each step. I combined a slow shutter speed with the flash. Parts of the image are frozen by the flash, like the girl in the center. And she is also at the center of the zoom, while the zooming smears everything else. I cropped the shot so she is not dead center, but she was when I took the shot. Achieving the final effect required many test shots. I had the model take the ride about 3 times, and after that's how long it took to get my basic test shots done. But she rode the ride 18 times, including the tests, in order to get the right expression. The results were good for me, but not for her, because she threw up after 18 rides. The night portrait mode can deliver some very interesting effects with moving subjects on many new cameras. In fact, it's a lot like the previous photo that I had where a flash was used with a moving subject. In this case, I was panning with the subject to create the blur. The flash froze the subject. This is actually a double exposure because the blurriness is created by a long shutter speed and the still image is achieved with the flash. But it was done with just one touch of the shutter in the night portrait mode. Now let's go and try some snap zoom techniques and be back here in 45 minutes. Okay, we're back. Now let's talk about gathering shots to use as interesting backgrounds in montages. This is an interesting shot, but the vacant area makes the photo incomplete. I took this with the intention of putting something on the left-hand side. It was actually shot for an advertisement for the county fair, and I left that space empty for a headline and some copy. But if I could have filled the space with another element, I can do that at any time. So here's a shot I did of a clown, and I just cut and pasted that clown right in there. This is why night photography offers you a chance to build a valuable library of exciting elements to use in montage photos. If your goal is to produce believable montages, placing each shot is absolutely critical. This is a good background. I took this shot at the right time of dusk to get everything exposed correctly. There was no Photoshop so far. This is just what the photo looked like. I left the space on the left vacant for my subject to be inserted. Next, I painted a new neon sign, replacing clam chowder with live jazz tonight. Then I photographed Terrell Eaton, a jazz musician. I did this shot in my house, and I combined them into a single shot for a CD cover. Note that important alterations make the images and the elements look more natural. There's a red rim light along his shirt, and then there's tiny red highlights on the silver flute, and a general color shift to make his face and hands look more reddish, as if they're being lit by the neon sign. This is the kind of planning that's needed to make a convincing montage. Here's another example. A portrait of a couple with their vintage car. It's a nice shot, but after they left, I waited until it got dark and the lights on the boardwalk came to life. Now, I had to stay in the same place and not move my camera for 2.5 hours because that's how long it took for the boardwalk to be lit up. The photos were combined in Photoshop. Now, these are not beginner assignments, but you can learn to do this technique if you're motivated and you assemble a library of good images. Most of your night shots will be straight, not montages, but you still have to know what you want and how to get it. And that takes experimentation and practice. Just following the basic rules of exposure and knowing when to use your flash will get you good results right away. Most dramatic night shots do not use a flash. A flash would have ruined this scene. For more control, like this advertising shot, the people were posed and pasted into a streaked background. The colors were enhanced, and it added a lot to the photo. This is the result of 2 different shots. They appear on the left. A lot of color manipulation in Photoshop really helped this. Note that the 2 images on the left are not interesting by themselves, but they become dramatic when they're combined. Now let's talk about how to get shots of the moon, the stars, and those dramatic star trails that we saw earlier in the show. The moon is always washed out in night photos. That's because it's sunny on the moon and dark on the earth. You can never get a proper exposure of the moon and nighttime on earth in the same shot. It simply cannot be done. There has to be some manipulation to get that shot. Since the moon is in bright sunlight, you'll need to use a daylight exposure for it. I generally start with about 125th of a second at f11 at ISO 200. On clear nights, you may have to speed the shutter up. Make sure you use manual focus when photographing the moon. Otherwise, your camera will be searching for a focus point and your images will be fuzzy. Also, when you're on a tripod, remember to turn off the VR mode, the vibration resistance on Nikon, and the IS mode on Canon. That's the image stabilization. I usually take at least 2 exposures to get my final image of the moon, one of the night scene and one of the moon, and then I combine them in Photoshop. Sometimes I leave a little halo around the moon. Now, on full moon nights, the long exposures will look like a daylight photo. The only clue to the time will be house or street lamps that are glowing. Getting great star shots requires going to dark places away from city lights. If you have a camera with good quality at high ISO settings, like the newer Sony models, I'd recommend keeping your exposures less than 8 seconds to avoid the stars turning into streaks. Amateur astronomer Steve Peters took this shot near Mono Lake with a Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter zoom lens on a full-frame Sony A7S body. The setting was ISO 12,800 and the aperture was f2.8 for 2.5 second exposure. But this is why Sony has become the favorite for star shooters, because the ISO at very, very high settings retains very good quality. This dramatic shot was created by a series of over 2,000 exposures, and each of them were about 10 seconds long over a 6-hour period. Digital cameras are not capable of taking long single exposures because the sensor gets hot and it'll burn out. For images like this, it's better to use a film camera. Here's a combination of many exposures and some light painting of the foreground. These images were combined in Photoshop. Here's a very good tutorial on how this image was created. You can see the tutorial at the web address on the screen. Here's the equipment you'll need if you want to do star trails with a digital camera, but it's complicated and the equipment can be a little pricey. That's why I use a film camera for star trails. This is an inexpensive approach to get star trails. The camera is a $200 used Nikon with a 24mm lens. I used Fuji slide film for this. To get fog effects at night, all you need to do is breathe onto your lens to fog it up. Begin with a well-exposed setup. And then you breathe on the lens to achieve the desired effect. As the vapor evaporates on the lens, the effect kind of dies back. So you want to take multiple exposures. The fogging effect works well with montage projects. Okay, well, thanks for watching that video. Just consult the text in the assignment for an abbreviated night photography assignment. Good luck to you. Stay safe.